2 toddlers, 1 stove. When police arrived, the kitchen smelled of burnt flesh, and the only witness was a 3-year-old child, sitting in silence. No signs of forced entry, no stranger, just their mother, and a horrifying scene no one could explain. What pushes a parent to commit the unthinkable? And how many warnings were ignored before it was too late? This is the case of Lamora Williams, a tragedy that could have been stopped. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, not out of peace, but from the vacuum left behind after something terrible has happened. Inside Unit 1322 of the Oakland City Housing Complex in Atlanta, Georgia, a suffocating odor lingered thick in the air. It was not smoke from a forgotten stove nor burnt dinner. It was something far more primal, burnt flesh. The walls, the floor, even the air itself seemed to tremble with the weight of what had occurred there. In the kitchen, the oven door hung open. Not wide, just enough. Just enough for a first responder to see the impossible. Small, charred remains curled unnaturally inside. The bodies were not simply burned, they had been cooked. The skin had blackened, tightened, drawn back from bone. Heat-induced rigor had frozen the limbs mid-twitch, as though the children had tried, at the last moment, to escape the metal tomb. On the kitchen tiles, near the appliance, fragments of flesh clung to the grout, suggesting an attempt to remove or reposition the bodies before or after death. There was no blood spatter, no evidence of forced trauma, just heat, dry, merciless, unrelenting heat, the kind that takes time, the kind that indicates intent. Nearby, a toddler sat silently on the living room carpet. Jamal Jr., just 3 years old, his eyes wide, unblinking. He didn't cry. He didn't move. He had seen it all. From a forensic standpoint, the crime scene bore signs of both emotional detachment and calculated post-event staging. The door had been left ajar, as if the suspect had tried to make the discovery seem sudden. But the layers of evidence contradicted that narrative. The smell alone, strong, old, unmistakably decayed, suggested that the bodies had been inside the oven for longer than a few hours, possibly days. There were no signs of a break-in, no fingerprints but hers, no footprints but those of the children, no cousin, no babysitter. Only one adult had been there. Only one story, unraveling under its own weight. What kind of mother does this? What kind of human being? These questions haunt both the public and professionals alike, but in criminal psychology, they are reframed. It is not why would she, but rather, what broke first? Because in cases like this, something always breaks before the act. Lamora Williams, 24, single mother of 4, had no documented history of violent crime, no arrest records, no history of drug abuse, but she had something more dangerous: untreated mental illness, isolation, and a long-standing pattern of emotional instability masked beneath a quiet exterior. What happened inside that apartment was not an explosion. It was erosion, slow, silent, invisible to everyone but the children. The apartment was a reflection of psychological collapse. Unwashed clothes, mold in the kitchen, food left out to rot. It was more than neglect. It was abandonment of reality itself. This is what experts in forensic psychiatry recognize as the onset of dissociative psychosis, a break from shared reality so severe that the individual no longer perceives life and death in the same terms as others. But even that cannot explain the sheer brutality of placing one's children into an oven. That detail, the oven, matters, not just because of the horror it evokes, but because of what it tells us about intent. A person in a fit of rage might hit, might shake, might throw, but to lift 2 children one by one, open an appliance, place them inside, close the door, and activate the heat. It is not spontaneous. It is controlled, measured, deliberate. It is, by definition, murder, and yet what makes this case more chilling is not the act itself, but the silence afterward. The hours spent inside that apartment, the surviving child sitting only feet away from the dead. The phone calls not made, to police, to family, but instead the call to the children's father, showing him what had been done, through a video, a display, a message, a final link in the chain of personal collapse. No sounds of struggle, no cries for help, no attempt to hide, just a mother, a stove, and the irreversible end of two lives that never had a chance to understand what was happening. It was not just a crime. It was a confession without words. A mother who, in those hours, had already ceased to see herself as one. A house no longer home. And an oven, forever cold in its silence, but still warm to the touch when authorities arrived. It is there, in that unbearable heat, that the first questions were asked. Not just about guilt, but about what had led this young woman, unemployed, overwhelmed, untreated, to the edge, and what had pushed her over. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us a lot. Thank you. Before the oven door ever opened, before the final call was made, there had already been signs, fractures in the surface of a life that was quietly falling apart. Lamora Williams was not born into violence. She was not the product of crime, nor shaped by a gang-infested neighborhood. Her beginnings were far more ordinary, and perhaps that's what makes her descent more disturbing. She had a mother, a sister, teachers who once described her as withdrawn, slow to respond, different. Not dangerous, but disconnected. Mental illness doesn't always announce itself with chaos. Often, it whispers. In Lamora's case, the signs began in childhood. Behavioral outbursts, difficulty focusing, an eerie fascination with objects that others found mundane, cutting doll heads, drawing pictures with unnatural precision but no emotion. These were not the signs people take seriously, not when they come from a quiet girl in a quiet home. Her mother, Brenda, tried to raise the alarm more than once, but no one came. By the time Lamora was an adult, the pattern had already been set. She struggled to hold jobs. She found herself in volatile relationships. She gave birth to her first child at 18, then 3 more in rapid succession. No partner stayed, no family member moved in. Her home became a revolving door of exhaustion, silence, and screaming toddlers. There was no diagnosis, no medication, no therapy, only time, and it was running out. In the months leading up to the murders, she had quit her job. Not because she wanted to, but because she could no longer manage it. Friends said she stopped answering calls. She refused visits. Her mother, growing increasingly concerned, called child services. She reported that the children were often left unfed, that Lamora was deteriorating. But once again, no one intervened. This is where the system fails. Not in the aftermath, when the cameras arrive, but in the silence before. When help is asked for and denied. When risk is visible but dismissed. Jamal Penn, the father of the 2 murdered boys, had long sensed something was wrong. He had left the relationship, but remained involved in the lives of his children. He visited, paid support, asked questions. But Lamora, increasingly distant, kept him at arm's length. He could not have imagined what she was capable of. Few could, but the signs were there. In late September 2017, Lamora told a friend she was overwhelmed, that she couldn't breathe around the children, that she needed a way out. These were not idle complaints, they were declarations. And yet, like so many cries from the mentally ill, they echoed into the void. Experts in criminal behavior recognize the tipping point in cases like this, not as a moment of rage, but as an intersection between psychological collapse and environmental pressure. Lamora was not just tired. She was isolated, paranoid, possibly psychotic. Her perception of reality had begun to twist. The children, once seen as extensions of her body and soul, had become something else entirely. Noise, burden, chaos. There is no single moment where a mother ceases to be a mother. But for Lamora, it likely came quietly, in the still of night, when no one else was watching. When depression is no longer sadness, but a kind of void, a detachment so complete even love can't find its way through. And so, in those final days, as the house grew darker and her mind more fractured, a transformation took place. Not sudden, but creeping. Not violent, but cold. Some professionals argue that what occurred in that apartment was the result of a full psychotic break. Others believe it was a calculated, if deranged, effort to silence the very thing she felt was destroying her life. Either way, the intent is undeniable. The means were chosen. The method was deliberate. This was not the act of someone who lost control. It was the act of someone who had already surrendered it. Someone who looked at her children, not with hatred, but with absence, with nothing. After the deaths, Lamora made no attempt to flee. She did not hide the bodies. She called the children's father, showed him what she had done, not in panic, but with calm detachment. And later, when she finally dialed 911, it was not to confess. It was to shift blame, to mention a cousin that didn't exist, to suggest that someone else had left the door open. But the facts betrayed her. There were no signs of anyone else, no evidence of a struggle, no timeline that matched her claims. What remains, then, is a case that doesn't scream. It whispers. It whispers of failure, personal, systemic, generational, of a woman unwell, unheard, and unseen until it was too late. It is not a simple thing to say that a mother killed her children, but it is a necessary truth here. And the truth, in its full measure, is more horrifying than any fiction. Because it didn't have to happen. It only did. Because no one listened. In the aftermath, as investigators combed through every inch of the apartment, questions continued to rise. Not only about what had occurred, but about everything that hadn't. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints but hers. The cousin she named in her statement was never found, and no neighbors reported seeing anyone entering or leaving her home that day. It became clear, almost immediately, that the story Lamora told was constructed after the fact. An attempt to rewrite the truth before it reached the outside world. But truth has a way of enduring, even through silence. The coroner's report only confirmed what was already suspected. The children, Jakarta and Keontae, had not died quickly. There were no signs of blunt force trauma, no broken bones. The burns were dry and extensive, suggesting prolonged exposure to high heat. Skin separated from muscle, tissue charred to the point of carbonization. The oven had not been turned on as a threat. It had been used, deliberately, as a weapon of slow destruction, a decision that required time, action, and a conscious effort to continue, even as flesh burned. Outside the apartment, neighbors gathered. Some whispered that they had heard crying days before. Others mentioned a foul odor, thinking it came from garbage or spoiled food. Still, no one knocked. No one called for help. And when asked why, their answers were always the same. We didn't want to get involved. She kept to herself. It wasn't our business. This isn't just a story about one woman losing control. It's about how easily we allow ourselves to look away. How comfortable it is to believe someone else will speak up. Someone else will step in. But no one did. Not when her mother called Child Protective Services and begged them to investigate. Not when she stopped showing up for work. Not when her children stopped playing outside. Reports show that Lamora had been reported to DFCS multiple times. Her own mother pleaded for custody of the children, warning that something terrible would happen if help didn't arrive. But each concern was either dismissed or lost in paperwork. The final report from the Division of Family and Children Services, issued after the boys' deaths, concluded that no prior allegations of abuse or neglect had been substantiated. But documented concern was not the same as inaction. The records existed. The warnings were there. And still, no one opened the door. In criminal profiling, there's a term, red flags in plain sight. It refers to patterns, behaviors, and conditions that, when isolated, might seem benign, but when seen together, they form a profile that demands intervention. Lamora's profile was not vague. It was textbook. A mother with a known history of mental instability, isolated, financially strained, repeatedly overwhelmed by the burden of caregiving, refusing help, exhibiting signs of dissociation, and yet no trigger was ever pulled on her case file. In the days following her arrest, Lamora remained mostly silent. Her responses were short, dispassionate. She never asked to see her surviving son, never cried when shown photographs of her children. Her face, even in court, remained still, expressionless. She pleaded not guilty. Some believe she no longer fully understood what had happened. Others think she simply didn't care. But beneath both lies the same terrifying truth. Somewhere, somehow, the switch that connects a human being to compassion, to remorse, had been shut off. Whether by trauma, mental illness, or a quiet decision that her children's pain no longer mattered. At the funeral, 2 small caskets were laid side by side. Inside were photographs of Jakarta and Keontae dressed as superheroes. The only surviving child, Jamal Jr., sat quietly in his father's arms, too young to grasp the finality of what had occurred, yet old enough to remember the heat. He had witnessed everything. He spoke about it for weeks afterward, telling his father again and again. They went into the stove. At night, he would ask if they were coming back. Number? They weren't. When asked why this case shook even the most experienced investigators, the answer was always the same. It wasn't just what Lamora did. It was that she did it in silence. No screams, no warnings, no visible madness, only stillness. A calm exterior hiding something deeply broken, deeply dangerous. The door to her apartment was never locked. Not when the act was committed. Not when the system should have entered. Not when a mother stopped seeing her children as her own. And that door, left ajar, is more than just a detail in a police report. It's a symbol of all the warnings missed, all the voices ignored, and all the lives lost, not in an instant, but slowly, in a heat that no one chose to feel. Justice may come in the form of an indictment or a sentence, or time in a facility built for the mentally unwell. But no courtroom, no diagnosis, no punishment will answer the question that remains. What would have happened if someone had knocked?